Manipulation. How Power Actually Works in Everyday Life. Written by Aaron Kairos. Narrated by Lyra Celine. Preface. Read this if something feels off. Most people do not realize they are being manipulated, not because they are stupid, and not because they are weak, but because manipulation rarely announces itself as force. It arrives as reason, as care, as urgency, as professionalism, as morality. It arrives wearing familiar clothes. It feels normal. It feels justified. It feels like what a decent, responsible person would do. If you picked up this book, it is likely because something in your life feels subtly wrong. Not dramatic, not explosive, persistent. You may feel tired in ways rest does not fix. You may notice that your time, attention, or energy seem to leak away without clear benefit. You may find yourself agreeing to things you later regret, explaining decisions you never wanted to make, or carrying responsibilities that were never clearly assigned. You might not call this manipulation. You might call it being reasonable, being kind, being realistic, being mature. That is exactly how it works. Manipulation is not primarily about lies. It is about pressure, applied quietly, incrementally, and often invisibly. It moves through emotion rather than argument, through timing rather than threat, through identity rather than command. It succeeds not by overpowering you, but by recruiting you. You do not feel forced. You feel responsible. This book begins from a simple premise. Most losses do not come from being overpowered. They come from participating without noticing. Manipulation is not an exception to social life. It is one of its organizing features. Wherever resources are limited, wherever dependence exists, wherever roles and identities carry expectations, leverage emerges. Most people sense this intuitively, but are taught to moralize it instead of understand it. They look for bad actors rather than mechanisms. They argue about intent rather than observe effect. As a result, they remain vulnerable to pressures that do not require malice to function. This is not a book about villains. It is not a book about tricks. It is not a book about becoming ruthless, dominant, or cleverer than everyone else. Those ambitions miss the point. The problem is not that you are losing games. The problem is that you are being pulled into games you never agreed to play. What follows is a map of how pressure actually moves in everyday life. Through guilt and fear, urgency and scarcity, authority and expertise, identity and belonging, information and narrative, money and work, care and obligation. Each chapter isolates a mechanism, not to inflame suspicion or encourage confrontation, but to restore orientation. The goal is not paranoia. It is precision. Precision changes posture, and posture changes outcomes. When you recognize guilt as leverage, you pause instead of rushing. When urgency reveals itself as a tactic, you reclaim time. When authority demands obedience without accountability, you slow the transfer of responsibility. When identity is used to corner you, you separate belonging from compliance. When information is framed to force movement, you stop mistaking speed for necessity. None of this requires exposure, argument, or drama. Most of it requires less explanation, not more. This book is defensive by design. Its purpose is not to sharpen your edge against others, but to help you stop bleeding quietly, to notice where pressure is entering your life, why it works, and how to reduce its hold without theatrics or escalation. Many of the dynamics described here are not malicious. Some are unconscious. Some are institutional. Some are cultural. Intent is less important than effect. You do not need to prove bad faith to protect yourself. You only need to see clearly. As you read, You may recognize situations, conversations, or relationships with uncomfortable accuracy. That discomfort is not a warning sign. It is calibration. It means something you already sensed is being articulated. You are not being told what to do. You are being shown what is being done. The world you move through is dense with pressure. It always has been, and it always will be. This book does not promise escape. It offers something more realistic: orientation. Once you see how manipulation works, you stop mistaking pressure for necessity, speed for importance, and response for obligation. You become harder to move without your consent. Read this book slowly, not because it is complex, but because its value lies in recognition. You will not need to memorize techniques. You will need to notice patterns. Many of them are already present in your life. This book does not ask you to change who you are. It asks you to stop giving away parts of yourself without deciding to. That is where power actually begins. Chapter 1. Manipulation is normal. Most people treat manipulation as a special event. They imagine it as something rare and dramatic. A con artist, an abusive partner, a corrupt politician, a predator with obvious intent. They believe that if they avoid bad people, they will avoid manipulation altogether. This belief is comforting because it allows the threat to be placed safely outside the self. It suggests that manipulation is an exception to ordinary life, rather than one of its governing conditions. This belief is false. Manipulation is not an anomaly. It is a normal feature of human life, because influence itself is normal. Wherever resources are limited, attention, time, money, status, security, belonging, people compete for them. Wherever people compete, they use whatever reliably produces movement. Sometimes they ask directly, but often they cannot. Direct requests can be refused. Direct demands provoke resistance, backlash, or withdrawal. So pressure is applied indirectly instead, socially, emotionally, psychologically, until the other person moves without ever being explicitly forced. That is manipulation in its everyday form, quiet and unremarkable, woven into ordinary interaction. It is not always malicious, and it is not always conscious. Many people manipulate without knowing they are doing so. They have learned, often early and unconsciously, that certain behaviors produce compliance. Guilt elicits concession. Flattery softens boundaries. Urgency short-circuits deliberation. Helplessness summons rescue. Moral accusation silences objection. Woundedness disarms resistance. Charm lubricates access. These behaviors are used the way tools are used, not because the user is evil, but because experience has shown them what works. This is why moral outrage is a weak defense. If you imagine manipulation as an ethical defect, you will consistently misread it. You will look for villains instead of mechanisms. You will be shocked by outcomes that are entirely predictable. You will waste time debating intent when the only thing that matters is effect. Manipulation is not a moral category. It is a technique of movement, a way of steering choices without appearing to steer them. The manipulator's first objective is not control in the crude sense. It is reduction. Reduction of your freedom of response, of the range of options that feel available to you. One path is made to feel socially dangerous, emotionally painful, or morally unacceptable, while another path is made to feel safe, relieving, responsible, or simply obvious. When this process works well, you do not experience it as coercion. You experience it as choice. You tell yourself that you decided freely. You explain your action in the language of kindness, duty, prudence, realism, or principle. You may even feel proud of your restraint or maturity. Meanwhile, the outcome aligns cleanly with someone else's interest. This is the signature of effective manipulation. Pressure is converted into self-justification, and the subject becomes the defender of the very outcome that constrained them. This is why intelligence offers no immunity. In some cases, it increases vulnerability. A person with a strong conscience can be guided through guilt. A person who values rationality can be guided through selective information and framed evidence. A person who prizes harmony can be guided through implied conflict. A person who fears appearing foolish can be guided through time pressure. The more refined your internal standards, the more handles you present to anyone who understands how to apply force without appearing to apply it. The modern world multiplies these handles at scale. Workplaces normalize compliance through uncertainty, evaluation, and implicit threat. Families enforce compliance through obligation, loyalty, and emotional debt. Markets enforce compliance through scarcity, comparison, and urgency. Media enforces compliance through moral narratives, fear, and repetition. Even friendships can harden into systems of leverage once status, attention, dependence, or need enters the relationship. You do not need to be weak to be moved. You only need to be human. There is a deeper reason manipulation is normal. Human beings are social animals who depend on one another. Dependence always creates leverage. If you need approval, you can be pressured through shame. If you need belonging, you can be pressured through exclusion. If you need love, you can be pressured through withdrawal. If you need income, you can be pressured through ambiguity. If you need peace, you can be pressured through the threat of conflict. Manipulation is simply leverage applied through psychology rather than force. This book is not written to turn you into a manipulator. That ambition is misplaced. People who fixate on outplaying others tend to become brittle, paranoid, and theatrical. They confuse cruelty with strength and control with intelligence, and eventually find themselves trapped inside the very games they believe they are mastering. This book has a simpler purpose: to help you stop losing ground without noticing. The first step is accepting the environment as it is. You are not moving through a world where everyone plays fair, speaks plainly, and means exactly what they say. You are moving through a world of needs and strategies, of institutions that apply pressure without apology, and of social life saturated with quiet negotiations that never announce themselves as negotiations. Once you accept that manipulation is normal, you stop being shocked by it. You stop moralizing it. You start observing it. And observation is the beginning of defense. In the next chapter, we will confront the most common misconception of all: that strong people are difficult to manipulate and weak people are easy. The truth is more precise and more unsettling. Some virtues protect you. Others expose you. Understanding which is which changes everything. Chapter 2: Why Good People Are the Easiest Targets. Manipulation does not hunt for weakness. It hunts for reliability. This is the first inversion most people miss. They imagine manipulators preying on the naive, the selfish, the ignorant, or the morally loose, assuming that corruption seeks out moral vacancy. In reality, the most consistently manipulable people are often conscientious, responsible, empathetic, and disciplined. Not because they lack intelligence or character, but because their responses are predictable. A person with a strong sense of duty can be pressured through obligation. A person who values kindness can be pressured through visible suffering. A person who prides themselves on fairness can be pressured through selective framing. A person who hates conflict can be pressured through tension. A person who wants to be seen as rational can be pressured through partial facts presented as complete. These are not flaws. They are virtues. The problem is that virtues, when left unguarded, become handles. Good people tend to assume reciprocity. They expect that good faith will be met with good faith, that sincerity will be mirrored, that restraint will be respected. When they encounter questionable behavior, they search first for benign explanations, stress, misunderstanding, emotional difficulty, before considering strategy. This generosity creates delay, and delay creates opportunity. Manipulation thrives precisely in that interval between perception and response, where hesitation masquerades as decency. A manipulator does not need you to be foolish. They need you to be consistent. If your reactions to guilt, urgency, praise, or moral framing are stable, they can be anticipated and exploited. The more coherent your internal rules, the easier it becomes to guide you around them. This is why being nice offers no protection. Niceness often carries an unspoken rule: I should not make things uncomfortable. That rule can be exploited indefinitely. All a manipulator must do is introduce discomfort, emotional, social, or moral, and you will move to relieve it, even when doing so costs you ground. Intelligence provides no immunity either. Intelligent people often confuse seeing manipulation with resisting it. Awareness alone does not prevent compliance. You may recognize the pressure clearly, describe it accurately to yourself, and still yield because yielding feels easier than carrying unresolved tension. In fact, intelligence can deepen vulnerability by supplying sophisticated justifications. You can explain why giving in was reasonable, why this situation was exceptional, why resistance would have been petty, inefficient, or unproductive. Manipulation rarely pushes you to do something you believe is wrong. It nudges you toward something you believe is reasonable. Empathy is another powerful point of entry. Empathy allows you to feel what others feel, which is a genuine human strength. It also allows others to deposit emotional weight inside you. Once that weight is there, the question becomes who will carry it. Many people respond by assuming responsibility for distress they did not cause and cannot resolve. This is one of the cleanest forms of manipulation, the transfer of discomfort. The manipulator experiences stress, anger, fear, or need and makes it your problem to solve. If you are empathetic, you feel compelled to act. If you resist, you feel cruel. The situation is framed so that compliance appears compassionate and refusal appears immoral. This dynamic appears everywhere, in families, workplaces, friendships, and institutions. It is rarely presented as control. It is presented as care. The desire to be fair creates another vulnerability. Fairness-oriented people want balanced accounts, complete information, and symmetrical judgment. Manipulators exploit this by controlling inputs. They provide just enough information to activate your fairness instinct while withholding what would complicate the picture. You respond by adjusting your behavior to restore balance, unaware that the scale itself has been weighted. By the time the full context becomes visible, the decision has already been made and rationalized. The most dangerous vulnerability, however, is self-concept. If you see yourself as responsible, strong, generous, principled, or morally serious, you will work to preserve that identity. Manipulation often operates by threatening it indirectly. You are not ordered to comply. You are shown, subtly and implicitly, what kind of person would refuse, and you recoil from that image. Compliance then feels like self-consistency rather than surrender. This is why manipulation feels internal rather than external. You are not pushed. You are drawn. None of this implies that values should be abandoned. That response would be self-defeating. The goal is not cynicism or callousness. It is understanding that virtues, like strength, require containment. Unbounded virtue is exploitable. Kindness without limits becomes obligation. Fairness without verification becomes submission. Empathy without separation becomes control. The people who are hardest to manipulate are not the coldest or most selfish. They are the ones who can tolerate temporary discomfort without rushing to resolve it. They can sit with guilt without obeying it. They can hear urgency without surrendering judgment. They can disappoint without collapsing. They are not less moral. They are more contained. In the next chapter, we will examine how manipulation actually moves in practice, quietly, incrementally, and without ever announcing itself as pressure. Once you see the pattern, you will recognize it everywhere. And once you recognize it, you regain the ability to decide, deliberately, when to engage and when to step back. Chapter 3. How Power Moves Without Announcing It. Manipulation rarely arrives as a demand. If it did, resistance would be simple. A demand draws a clear boundary. You can accept it or refuse it, recognize it as pressure, and respond accordingly. Most manipulation avoids this clarity. It works instead by reshaping the conditions under which a decision is made, so that one option becomes emotionally costly, while another feels relieving, responsible, or inevitable. Power, in its everyday form, does not say, "do this." It asks something quieter and more effective. Why wouldn't you? One of the primary ways power moves without announcing itself is through framing. Framing determines what a situation is before you ever consider what to do about it. Is this a favor or an obligation? A request or an expectation? A mistake or a failure? A disagreement or a moral breach? Once a frame is accepted, most responses vanish without debate. You do not argue about whether to help someone in need. You do not negotiate with a moral imperative. You do not delay when something is presented as urgent. The decision feels settled because the interpretation arrived first. Another quiet movement of power is incremental pressure. Rarely are you asked to give everything at once. You are asked for something small, then something slightly larger, each step framed as reasonable in isolation. Each concession resets the baseline. By the time you notice the direction of movement, you are far from where you intended to be, and reversing course feels disproportionate or hostile. This is how boundaries erode without confrontation. Incremental pressure works because people judge decisions locally rather than structurally. You ask whether this request is fair, not whether the trajectory as a whole is acceptable. Manipulation exploits this habit by never demanding enough at once to provoke refusal. Power also moves through distortion of time. Urgency compresses judgment. When time is scarce, you rely on habits, emotions, and default values. You stop checking assumptions. You stop asking what is missing. You act to relieve pressure. Manipulators introduce urgency not because something truly requires speed, but because speed bypasses scrutiny. The faster you move, the less likely you are to notice imbalance or asymmetry. Once you comply under urgency, the result is normalized. What was framed as an exception quietly becomes policy. Another common mechanism is responsibility shifting. Instead of being told what to do, you are made to feel responsible for an outcome you do not control. Someone else's stress, anger, disappointment, or failure is placed at your feet. If you do not act, you are positioned as the cause of harm, even though the situation existed before you entered it. This technique is particularly effective against conscientious people who confuse empathy with obligation. They accept responsibility where none was assigned and then act to relieve the burden. Power does not need to accuse you directly. It allows you to accuse yourself. Ambiguity is another silent ally of power. Clear situations allow clear decisions. Ambiguous situations force interpretation. When information is incomplete, people tend to defer to authority, to norms, to implied expectations. Manipulation thrives in this uncertainty. By withholding clarity, The manipulator keeps you off balance while appearing neutral or innocent. You hesitate because you do not want to misjudge. They advance because hesitation benefits them. Power also moves through normalization. Behaviors that would once have felt unacceptable are introduced casually, without emphasis or explanation. No justification is offered. Over time, the absence of resistance is taken as consent. What was once unthinkable becomes routine simply because nothing stopped it. Normalization does not persuade, it exhausts. Perhaps the most subtle movement of power is self-enlistment. You are not ordered to act. You volunteer. You offer help. You take initiative. You step in to fix what appears obviously broken. Only later do you recognize that the situation was structured, so your intervention was predictable. Your effort saved someone else the cost of acting. Because you chose it, you feel ownership. Because you own it, you continue. This is why effective manipulation often feels like cooperation rather than control. At no point were you threatened. At no point were you openly deceived. You were guided through your own values, habits, and discomforts. Power moved not against you, but through you. Understanding this shifts the questions you ask. Instead of asking whether a request is reasonable, you begin to ask what changed just before it felt reasonable. Instead of asking whether you are being treated fairly, you ask who benefits if you move right now. Instead of asking what the right thing to do is, you ask why this feels urgent, personal, or morally charged. These questions do not make you cynical. They make you harder to rush, harder to corner, and harder to steer. In the next chapter, we will examine the most common instruments used to apply this pressure directly. Emotional leverage. Guilt, fear, obligation, and flattery are not accidents of personality. They are tools. Once you understand how they function, they lose much of their automatic force, not because they disappear, but because you stop obeying them on reflex. Chapter 4. Emotional leverage. The most reliable way to move people is not through logic, but through feeling. Emotions arrive faster than thought and linger longer than facts. They shape perception before judgment has time to intervene. By the time reasoning begins, the direction of movement is often already set. This is why emotional manipulation does not need to overpower you. It only needs to tilt you. The most common emotional levers are guilt, fear, obligation, and flattery. They appear in different forms, but they share a single function. They make inaction feel worse than compliance. Guilt is pressure disguised as conscience. It works by framing refusal as moral failure. You are not told that you must comply. You are shown the emotional cost of not complying. Disappointment, suffering, or harm is implied, and you are placed inside the causal chain. The manipulative move is subtle but decisive. Responsibility is reassigned without discussion. You did not create the situation, and you may not be able to resolve it, yet the emotional burden is placed on you. If you hesitate, you feel selfish. If you refuse, you feel cruel. Compliance restores your self-image, even if it quietly breeds resentment later. Guilt is especially effective against people who take their character seriously, who see themselves as decent, fair, or dependable. The clearer your moral self-image, the more pressure guilt can exert. The key signal of guilt-based manipulation is simple. You feel responsible for feelings you did not cause. Fear operates by narrowing options. It exaggerates risk and compresses time. Loss, exclusion, punishment, or chaos is suggested just beyond the horizon. You are not invited to evaluate probability or evidence. You are urged to prevent disaster. Fear-based manipulation rarely relies on explicit threats. It works through implication, a warning tone, a raised eyebrow, a story about what usually happens. The danger remains vague enough to evade challenge, yet vivid enough to provoke action. Fear is effective because it makes delay feel reckless. Acting feels safer than waiting, even when the action itself carries long-term cost. The signal here is urgency without clarity. When fear is being used, speed is emphasized and specifics are withheld. Obligation is history turned into leverage. Past favors, roles, sacrifices, or relationships are invoked to create present compliance. What you did before becomes what you must do now. The past is framed as a debt that never expires. This form of pressure exploits continuity. You are not asked to make a new decision. You are pressed to remain consistent with who you have already been. Obligation often hides behind familiar phrases. After all we've done, you're the only one. This is just how things work. Refusal is framed not as a choice, but as betrayal. The danger of obligation-based manipulation is that it erases boundaries. There is always one more request, because the debt is never fully repaid. The signal is repetition without renegotiation. When the same justification is used again and again, obligation has replaced agreement. Flattery operates through identity rather than emotion alone. It works by appealing to how you want to be seen. You are framed as uniquely capable, especially trustworthy, unusually reasonable, or morally superior. The request that follows is positioned as confirmation of that image. If you comply, you affirm the identity. If you refuse, you contradict it. Flattery is effective because it recruits your self-concept. You are no longer deciding what to do. You are deciding who you are. Resistance feels like self-denial. The signal here is praise that precedes pressure. When appreciation appears only at the moment something is needed, it is not appreciation. These levers are rarely used in isolation. They are combined, layered, and adjusted in real time. A request may begin with flattery, escalate through obligation, and conclude with guilt or fear. The movement feels natural because each step prepares the ground for the next. Emotional leverage is often not conscious. Many people use it instinctively, repeating what has worked before. Intent does not alter effect. The most common mistake people make is trying to defeat emotional pressure with facts, fairness, or logic. This fails because emotional leverage is not about correctness. It is about discomfort. Defense does not require emotional numbness. It requires delay. When you suddenly feel responsible, urgently needed, morally cornered, or uniquely chosen, pause long enough to ask a single question. What emotion is being activated right now, and what action would relieve it? That question creates distance, and distance restores choice. In the next chapter, we will examine another powerful accelerator of compliance: time. Urgency and scarcity are among the most effective tools of manipulation precisely because they feel external and objective. They are not. They are constructed. Chapter 5: Urgency and Time Pressure. Few things override judgment faster than the sensation that time is running out. Urgency works by reframing hesitation as danger. When time feels scarce, reflection appears irresponsible, even negligent. Acting, any action, feels safer than waiting. This is why urgency is one of the most reliable tools of manipulation. It converts uncertainty into motion. Time pressure does not need to be real. It only needs to be felt. The most common form of urgency-based manipulation is the artificial deadline. You are told that a decision must be made now, or an opportunity will vanish, a problem will escalate, or consequences will follow. The specifics are often vague, but the pressure is unmistakable. Delay is framed as loss. Under urgency, people do not evaluate options. They default to habit, authority, or emotion, choosing the path that relieves pressure fastest rather than the one that best serves their interests. This response is not irrational. It is human. Urgency also bypasses consent. You are not asked whether the timeline is acceptable. It is presented as an objective feature of the situation, something fixed and unquestionable. Challenging it feels pedantic, uncooperative, or obstructive. By the time you realize that the timeline was negotiable or entirely imaginary, the decision has already been made and normalized. Another form of time pressure is scarcity. Scarcity suggests that what is being offered is limited. Time, access, availability, attention. It activates loss aversion, the tendency to fear losing something more than to value gaining something of equal worth. The prospect of missing out drives action, even when the offer itself is mediocre, misaligned, or harmful. Scarcity becomes especially potent when paired with identity. You are told that not everyone receives this opportunity, that you are selected, that hesitation might signal disinterest or incompetence. The decision shifts from an evaluation of value to a test of worth. Urgency is also manufactured through escalation. A situation is framed as deteriorating. What was manageable yesterday is presented as critical today. If you do not act now, the problem will grow, relationships will sour, or trust will erode. The pressure increases not because the situation changed, but because the framing did. Escalation collapses the future into the present and denies you the space to observe whether a crisis is real or constructed. One of the most subtle uses of time pressure is borrowed urgency. Someone else's deadline becomes yours. Their stress becomes your emergency. Their failure to plan is reframed as your responsibility to act quickly. If you resist, you are positioned as unsupportive, uncommitted, or difficult. Borrowed urgency feels compassionate to absorb. You are helping. In reality, you are carrying pressure that does not belong to you. The defining feature of urgency-based manipulation is asymmetry. The person applying pressure benefits from speed, while you bear the cost of error. If the decision goes wrong, you live with the consequences. If it goes right, the urgency disappears and is rarely acknowledged. This asymmetry is the signal. Real urgency is shared. Manipulative urgency is transferred. The defense against urgency is not refusal. It is the reclamation of time. This can be as simple as saying that you need to think, that you will get back to them, or that the answer is not available today. These responses feel weak only because urgency has been framed as moral obligation. In reality, they restore symmetry. They test whether the urgency is real. If the situation collapses when you pause, it was built on pressure rather than necessity. Delay is not indecision. Delay is resistance. Once urgency is recognized as a tactic rather than a condition, much of its force dissolves. You stop asking whether you should act quickly and begin asking who benefits if you do. In the next chapter, we will examine another powerful instrument of manipulation: authority. Titles, expertise, credentials, and confidence are frequently used to suspend judgment and transfer responsibility. Understanding how authority is performed is essential to resisting it. Chapter 6: Authority and Trust Me games. Authority is one of the oldest shortcuts to compliance. When authority is present, judgment is expected to defer. Questions feel inappropriate. Hesitation feels disrespectful. Responsibility shifts quietly from the person acting to the person directing. If something goes wrong, You followed instructions. If something goes right, the authority was correct. This transfer of responsibility is not a side effect. It is the appeal. Authority-based manipulation does not require formal power. It requires only the appearance of it. Titles, credentials, confidence, seniority, experience, age, and institutional affiliation all function as signals that discourage scrutiny. Once these signals are accepted, decision-making compresses. Evaluation gives way to deference. The most common authority move is implicit rather than explicit. It sounds like reassurance rather than command. I've done this before. This is how it works. You don't need to worry. These statements are not arguments. They are cues that further examination is unnecessary. When authority is genuine and accountable, this shortcut can be efficient. When authority is unearned, misaligned, or self-protective, it becomes leverage. One way authority manipulates is through information asymmetry. The authority claims access to knowledge you do not have. Sometimes this is true. Manipulation begins when that asymmetry is used to close questions rather than answer them. Details are summarized instead of explained. Concerns are reframed as misunderstanding. You are told that if you knew what they knew, you would agree. This creates dependency. You stop evaluating the situation and start evaluating the person. If you trust them, you comply. If you doubt them, you feel irrational, unqualified, or difficult. Either way, the decision moves away from you. Another common move is confidence substitution. Confidence is frequently mistaken for competence. A steady tone, decisive language, and the absence of hesitation are taken as evidence of mastery. Many people assume that someone who speaks without doubt must know what they are doing. This assumption is exploitable. Confidence is cheap to perform and requires no evidence. Once you comply, the outcome is locked in. If the decision fails, the authority can reframe the result, revise the narrative, or attribute failure to external factors. The cost remains yours. Authority also operates through delegated responsibility. You are told what to do, but not why. The authority retains authorship of the decision while assigning execution to you. If you object, you are framed as insubordinate or uncooperative. If you comply and the result is harmful, you are told that you misunderstood instructions or failed to implement them correctly. This ambiguity protects the authority while exposing you. One of the most subtle authority games is borrowed legitimacy. Someone invokes an institution, policy, expert consensus, or unnamed higher authority. Legal says this is fine. This comes from above. That's the standard. The source is vague enough that it cannot be challenged directly. Responsibility diffuses upward and outward. You are left complying with an abstraction rather than a person. Authority-based manipulation often relies on role pressure. You are reminded of who you are supposed to be in the situation: a team player, a professional, a loyal member, a responsible adult. The role carries expectations, and refusal is framed as failure to inhabit it properly. You are not ordered to comply. You are shown what kind of person would refuse, and you recoil from the implication. The danger of authority is not obedience. It is abdication. When authority is accepted without scrutiny, you surrender not only decision-making, but the right to evaluate consequences. This is how ordinary people come to participate in outcomes they later claim to oppose. The defense against authority is not rebellion. It is the reclamation of authorship. This begins by clarifying what is being decided and by whom, identifying where responsibility actually lies, distinguishing expertise from authority, and slowing down confident claims that arrive without explanation. Simple questions restore balance. What happens if this goes wrong? Who owns that risk? What alternatives were considered? What is the reasoning behind this choice? These questions are not confrontational. They are diagnostic. When authority resists clarification, it is relying on leverage rather than competence. Trust is not submission. Trust is conditional alignment. You can respect expertise without surrendering judgment. You can follow direction without forfeiting responsibility. Authority becomes manipulative only when it demands obedience without accountability. In the next chapter, we will examine a deeper and more intimate form of manipulation: identity. When pressure attaches to who you are, your values, loyalty, and sense of belonging, resistance becomes psychologically expensive. Understanding identity capture is essential to breaking free. Chapter 7: Identity Capture. The most powerful form of manipulation does not target what you want. It targets who you are. Once pressure attaches to identity, resistance becomes costly. You are no longer deciding whether an action makes sense. You are deciding whether you will remain loyal to a version of yourself. At that point, refusal feels like self-betrayal rather than choice. Identity capture works by linking compliance to belonging. You are reminded, subtly or explicitly, of the group you are part of: a family, a team, a profession, a movement, a culture. Expectations are embedded in that identity. Certain behaviors are framed as natural, honorable, or expected, while others are framed as deviant, selfish, or disloyal. The request that follows is never presented as coercion. It is presented as consistency. This is why identity-based manipulation is so difficult to resist. You are not being pushed. You are being pulled back into alignment. One common form of identity capture is loyalty framing. Loyalty is treated as unconditional. Past inclusion becomes a permanent claim on future behavior. Shared history, shared struggle, or shared values are invoked to create present compliance. The implication is unmistakable. If you refuse now, you were never truly part of the group. Choice is reframed as treachery. Another form is moral identity capture. You are associated with virtues such as kindness, fairness, responsibility, or courage. A situation is framed so that only one response aligns with those virtues. Alternatives are not debated. They are morally disqualified. You are not asked to decide what is right. You are shown what a good person would do. Once morality is activated in this way, calculation stops. Identity capture also operates through role enforcement. You are reminded of your role: parent, professional, leader, friend, supporter. Each role carries implicit duties, and those duties are invoked selectively, often at moments when compliance is needed. The role itself is not open to negotiation. It is assumed. Refusal is framed not as disagreement, but as failure to perform the role correctly. Another powerful technique is us versus them framing. Group identity is strengthened through contrast. An external threat, enemy, or critic is emphasized. Unity becomes a moral necessity. Dissent becomes betrayal. Under these conditions, internal pressure intensifies. Members begin policing themselves and one another without direct instruction. This is manipulation that no longer requires a visible manipulator. Identity capture is especially effective because it recruits emotion, history, and social cost simultaneously. To resist is not simply to say no. It is to risk exclusion, shame, or loss of status. Many people comply not because they agree, but because the alternative feels isolating. The defining feature of identity capture is non-negotiability. There is no space to discuss limits, conflicts of values, or competing obligations. The identity is presented as total. If you belong, you comply. The defense against identity capture is not the rejection of identity. It is the restoration of boundaries. This requires separating values from obedience, belonging from compliance, and identity from obligation. Doing so demands tolerance for discomfort. When identity is used as leverage, the fastest relief comes from submission. The slower relief comes from refusal followed by recalibration. Some relationships weaken. Some groups distance themselves. This is the cost of reclaiming authorship. Identity that cannot tolerate boundaries is not identity. It is control. You do not owe unlimited access or obedience to anyone simply because you share history, values, or affiliation. Loyalty without limits becomes exploitation. Morality without choice becomes coercion. The goal is not detachment, but discernment. You can care without complying. You can belong without obeying. You can hold values without being owned by them. Once identity is no longer a lever, manipulation loses one of its most reliable tools. In the next chapter, we will examine how information itself is used as pressure, through withholding, flooding, and framing. Manipulation does not always add emotion. Sometimes it overwhelms you with facts or starves you of them until movement feels like the only relief. Chapter 8. Information Control. Information is not neutral. Who possesses it, who withholds it, who floods it, and who frames it determines how decisions are made long before those decisions feel voluntary. Manipulation through information does not rely solely on falsehood. It relies on control of context. The simplest form of information control is withholding. You are given just enough information to act, but not enough to evaluate. Details are postponed, questions are deflected, and clarification is promised later. By the time the full picture emerges, your position is already committed. Withholding works because people are uncomfortable with uncertainty. Faced with incomplete information, many default to trust, authority, or habit, assuming the missing pieces will not materially alter the outcome. Manipulation exploits that assumption. The signal is asymmetry. Someone else knows more than you, and that imbalance is treated as normal rather than temporary. Another common tactic is selective disclosure. Facts are not hidden, they are curated. Certain data points are emphasized while others are minimized, delayed, or omitted. The account appears complete, but it is structured. You are not lied to, you are guided. Selective disclosure is effective because people rarely question what is visible. They question what is absent only when prompted. Manipulation depends on that absence remaining unnoticed. The signal here is coherence without depth. The explanation feels tidy, but leaves no space for alternatives. Information can also be weaponized through overload. Instead of receiving too little information, you receive too much. Data, opinions, reports, and updates arrive faster than they can be processed. The volume itself becomes pressure. Exhaustion replaces analysis. You comply not because you are persuaded, but because you want the noise to stop. Overload shifts decision-making from evaluation to avoidance. You choose the option that promises resolution, even if it is suboptimal. Manipulation succeeds by creating fatigue rather than conviction. The signal is confusion, paired with urgency. Another subtle tactic is presenting facts as settled. Information is framed as consensus, policy, or standard practice. Alternatives are implied to be fringe, outdated, or irresponsible. The debate is declared over before you have entered it. Questioning feels disruptive rather than thoughtful. This approach is particularly effective in institutional settings, where conformity is rewarded and dissent carries cost. The signal is closure without process. You are told what was decided, not how it was decided. Information control also operates through sequencing. The order in which information is presented shapes interpretation. Early data anchors perception, and later information is interpreted through that lens. By controlling sequence, a manipulator can bias outcomes without altering facts. First impressions harden quickly. Corrections rarely fully undo them. The signal here is early certainty followed by quiet revision. Perhaps the most overlooked form of information manipulation is plausible ignorance. Someone claims not to know critical details while acting as if those details are irrelevant. Responsibility is deferred. Accountability dissolves. If outcomes are negative, ignorance becomes a shield. If outcomes are positive, authority is claimed retroactively. This tactic keeps others exposed while remaining insulated. The defense against information control is not total skepticism. It is structural awareness. Instead of asking whether something is true, ask what you are not being shown. Who benefits from the framing? Why this information is arriving now? And what happens if you wait? You are not obligated to decide under conditions of incompleteness, overload, or asymmetrically controlled information. Delay is not obstruction. It is the restoration of balance. Clarity rarely arrives fully formed. It emerges through time, comparison, and restraint. Manipulation collapses that process. Defense restores it. In the next chapter, we will examine where these techniques converge most painfully: work and organizations. Manipulation is often normalized as professionalism, loyalty, or efficiency. Understanding how power operates inside institutions is essential to protecting yourself without becoming cynical or isolated. Chapter 9: Work and Organizations. Work is one of the most efficient environments for manipulation because dependence is built in. You need income, stability, and reputation. These needs create leverage long before anyone applies pressure deliberately. Organizations do not have to threaten you to move you. They only have to preserve ambiguity. One of the most common forms of workplace manipulation is uncertain evaluation. You are rarely told exactly how performance is measured. Criteria shift quietly. Feedback remains vague. Success is implied but never defined. This uncertainty keeps you attentive, compliant, and self-correcting. You spend energy trying to align with expectations that are never fully stated. The pressure is internalized. You manage yourself on the organization's behalf. Another pervasive mechanism is role inflation. Responsibilities expand without formal acknowledgement. What begins as a favor becomes expectation. Temporary coverage becomes permanent workload. Each addition is framed as reasonable, even flattering. Refusal feels petty or uncooperative. Over time, your role grows while compensation, authority, and clarity remain static. This is not oversight. It is extraction. Workplace manipulation also operates through selective recognition. Effort is noticed inconsistently. Praise is distributed strategically. Certain behaviors are rewarded publicly, while others disappear without comment. You learn which actions produce visibility and which go unseen. Gradually, behavior aligns not with value creation, but with reward signaling. The danger is misalignment. You begin optimizing for recognition rather than effectiveness. Manufactured urgency is another familiar tool. Deadlines appear suddenly. Crises are declared late. Poor planning upstream becomes pressure downstream. You are told that flexibility equals professionalism and that resistance signals attitude rather than discernment. Borrowed urgency is reframed as work ethic. When absorbed repeatedly, it produces exhaustion rather than excellence. Organizations also manipulate through professional identity. You are reminded of what good employees do: go the extra mile, stay late, be team players, avoid negativity. These norms are rarely paired with reciprocal protections. They are invoked selectively, usually when compliance is needed. Refusal is framed as a character flaw rather than a contractual boundary. Information control is especially potent in institutional settings. Decisions are described as coming from above. Rationales are summarized. Alternatives are omitted. Responsibility diffuses. If outcomes fail, blame flows downward. If outcomes succeed, credit flows upward. This structure discourages questioning and rewards obedience while preserving deniability. Perhaps the most corrosive form of workplace manipulation is moral laundering. Exploitation is reframed as opportunity. Overwork becomes growth. Instability becomes agility. Control becomes culture. Language softens pressure until it becomes difficult to name. You sense that something is wrong, but lack the vocabulary to articulate it without sounding unprofessional or disloyal. The defense in organizational environments is not confrontation. It is clarity and containment. You protect yourself by clarifying expectations before accepting responsibility, renegotiating when roles expand, documenting agreements, resisting urgency that is not shared, and separating identity from employment. Work is a transaction, not a family. Loyalty is contextual, not absolute. This stance does not require cynicism. It requires realism. You can perform well without absorbing everything. You can contribute without surrendering boundaries. You can be reliable without being endlessly flexible. Organizations respect limits more than they admit. They test them constantly. Those who set none are managed hardest. In the next chapter, we will examine another domain where manipulation is normalized and emotionally charged: money. Debt, scarcity, and financial obligation are among the most powerful tools of pressure because they reach directly into fear and survival. Chapter 10: Money, Debt, and Financial Pressure. Money is one of the most efficient instruments of manipulation because it sits at the intersection of fear and necessity. Unlike social pressure, financial pressure does not need to be subtle. The threat of loss is often enough. Rent, debt, credit, and income insecurity compress choice long before anyone speaks. When money is involved, compliance is routinely framed as realism rather than coercion, as if necessity itself absolves power of intent. This framing is effective because financial manipulation shortens horizons. When resources feel scarce, long-term consequences fade from view. Decisions are made to survive the moment, not to protect the future. The more urgent the need, the less leverage you have to negotiate terms. Pressure works not by argument, but by narrowing what feels possible. Debt is the clearest example. Debt converts future freedom into present obligation. It establishes a standing claim on your time, labor, and attention. Once indebted, pressure no longer needs to be actively applied. The structure enforces itself. Missed payments are framed as moral failure. Compliance becomes responsibility. The manipulative move is not the loan itself. It is the normalization of dependency as ordinary life. Another common tactic is conditional relief. You are offered extensions, discounts, forgiveness, or flexibility, but only if you accept additional terms. Relief is framed as generosity. In reality, it deepens control. Each concession binds you more tightly because refusal now appears ungrateful, reckless, or immature. This is how temporary assistance becomes permanent leverage. Financial pressure also operates through opaque complexity. Contracts, fees, interest structures, penalties, and fine print are often deliberately difficult to understand. Complexity discourages scrutiny. People defer to authority, trust the system, or assume the details do not matter. By the time consequences surface, renegotiation is no longer possible. Confusion becomes consent. Another mechanism is status comparison. You are encouraged to measure yourself against others, what they earn, own, or consume. This comparison manufactures need. You feel behind, inadequate, or irresponsible. The pressure to catch up drives decisions that benefit lenders, employers, and sellers more than you. The manipulation is not the comparison itself. It is the internalization of someone else's benchmark as your own. Money is also used to enforce silence. Financial dependence discourages dissent. When your income, benefits, or security are at stake, speaking becomes risky. This is how organizations and institutions maintain compliance without issuing overt threats. The cost of resistance is implied rather than stated. Over time, you learn what not to say. Perhaps the most corrosive form of financial manipulation is moralization. Poverty is framed as personal failure. Debt is framed as irresponsibility. Wealth is framed as virtue. These narratives obscure structural leverage and relocate blame onto individuals. If you struggle, you feel ashamed. Shame reduces resistance. You accept terms you would otherwise challenge. The defense against financial manipulation is not austerity or obsession. It is positioning. You reduce leverage by minimizing standing obligations, avoiding irreversible commitments, demanding clarity before agreement, separating identity from income, and maintaining optionality where possible. This does not mean rejecting all debt or risk. It means recognizing that every financial arrangement encodes a power relationship. Someone benefits from your dependency. Someone profits from your urgency. Money does not only buy goods and services. It buys compliance, silence, and time. Seeing this clearly does not make you fearful. It makes you deliberate. In the next chapter, we will move into a domain where manipulation feels personal rather than transactional. Family, relationships, and care. Pressure here is rarely acknowledged as control, yet it is often the hardest to resist because love, obligation, and fear of loss are tightly intertwined. Chapter 11. Family, relationships, and care as control manipulation. In close relationships is the hardest to name because it rarely presents itself as power. It appears as concern, as love, as responsibility. This is precisely why it works. Family and intimate relationships carry emotional depth, shared history, and implicit obligation. These elements create powerful leverage even in the absence of malicious intent. Pressure does not need to be engineered. It emerges naturally wherever care and dependence overlap. One of the most common mechanisms is emotional responsibility shifting. You are made to feel accountable for another person's emotional state. Their sadness, anger, anxiety, or disappointment becomes something you are expected to manage. If they suffer and you do not act, you are framed, implicitly or explicitly, as the cause. This is not support. It is burden transfer. The signal is subtle but consistent. Discomfort appears when you resist, and relief appears when you comply. Another common pattern is conditional care. Affection, approval, or warmth is offered when you align, and withdrawn when you resist. The withdrawal may be quiet, a change in tone, distance, or silence, but it is felt. Over time, behavior adapts to avoid the loss. No threats are required. The relationship itself becomes the lever. Family systems also rely heavily on role enforcement. You are reminded, sometimes gently and sometimes sharply, of who you are supposed to be. The responsible one, the peacemaker, the strong one, the successful one. These roles are not negotiated. They are inherited. When pressure arises, the role is invoked to justify expectation. Refusal is framed not as a choice, but as abandonment of identity. Another powerful tactic is history as obligation. Past sacrifices are recalled to demand present compliance. What someone did for you years ago is treated as a permanent claim on your behavior now. Gratitude becomes debt, and the account never closes. The difficulty is that the past is real. Care was given. Help was offered. This reality makes resistance feel ungrateful, even when the demand itself is unreasonable. Manipulation in relationships also appears as crisis cycling. Emotional emergencies recur just as boundaries begin to form. Each crisis resets expectations. Each intervention postpones change. You are kept in a state of readiness, always responding and never resolving. The relationship stabilizes around your availability rather than mutual responsibility. Another form is moral inversion. Your attempt to set boundaries is reframed as cruelty. Your need for space becomes selfishness. Your refusal to comply becomes harm. Rather than engaging the boundary itself, the manipulator attacks the character of the person setting it. Boundaries begin to feel dangerous. The defining feature of relational manipulation is entanglement. You cannot easily separate the request from the relationship. Saying no feels like rejecting the person rather than declining the behavior. This is why people remain in dynamics they recognize as damaging. The cost of resistance feels higher than the cost of compliance, until eventually it is not. The defense in relational contexts is not emotional withdrawal. It is differentiation. This means separating care from compliance, empathy from responsibility, and love from obligation. It requires tolerating another person's discomfort without rushing to resolve it. It requires allowing disappointment to exist without absorbing it. It requires accepting that not all needs are yours to meet. This process does not destroy relationships. It clarifies them. Healthy care survives boundaries. Manipulative care depends on their absence. When care is no longer available as leverage, relationships recalibrate. Some deepen. Some weaken. This is not failure. It is information. In the next chapter, we will examine the largest and most diffuse manipulation system most people encounter: media and public narratives. Here, pressure does not come from individuals, but from stories that shape what feels acceptable, urgent, or moral, often without a clear source. Chapter 12. Media, Narratives, and Moral Coercion. Manipulation at the level of media does not feel personal. That is its advantage. Unlike pressure from individuals or institutions, narrative pressure arrives without a face. There is no one to confront and no clear intent to interrogate. Influence appears instead as atmosphere, what everyone knows, what is treated as obvious, what is assumed to be settled. This form of manipulation does not command behavior directly. It shapes the boundaries of acceptable thought. The primary mechanism is moral compression. Complex situations are collapsed into simple moral frames: good and bad, victim and perpetrator, right side and wrong side. Nuance becomes suspicious. Context is dismissed as excuse-making. Hesitation is reframed as complicity. Once this compression takes hold, judgment is no longer about understanding. It is about alignment. You are not asked what you think. You are asked where you stand. Another powerful mechanism is the illusion of consensus. Views are presented as widely shared whether they are or not. Repetition substitutes for agreement. Visibility substitutes for majority. When a position appears ubiquitous, dissent feels isolating and risky. Many people comply not because they are persuaded, but because they do not want to stand alone. Silence is interpreted as agreement, and agreement is assumed to be the norm. Media manipulation also operates through selective outrage. Certain events are amplified relentlessly, while others disappear without trace. Emotional energy is directed unevenly. Over time, this conditions response. People learn which reactions are rewarded with attention and which are ignored. Moral attention becomes a scarce resource allocated by narrative relevance rather than by harm or consequence. The result is not apathy, but misdirection. Another effective tool is temporal stacking. Stories are layered rapidly, often before any resolution occurs. New crises replace old ones. Attention is never allowed to settle long enough for accountability or reflection. Emotional response becomes continuous but shallow. Fatigue sets in. In this state, simplified narratives feel like relief. People stop asking whether a story is accurate and begin asking whether it feels familiar. Narrative pressure also works through identity signaling. Public positions become markers of virtue, intelligence, or belonging. Expressing the approved view signals moral membership. Expressing doubt signals deficiency. The substance of the belief becomes secondary to the social signal it carries. This produces performative alignment. People are pressured to express opinions not to influence outcomes, but to confirm identity. The system rewards visibility, not understanding. Those who speak most loudly appear most committed, regardless of comprehension. Perhaps the most corrosive form of narrative manipulation is moral urgency without agency. You are made to feel responsible for large, abstract problems over which you have no meaningful control. You are urged to care deeply, react publicly, and align immediately, yet offered no avenue for action beyond expression. Emotional energy is extracted without resolution. The result is chronic agitation rather than effective engagement. The defense against narrative coercion is not withdrawal from information. It is selective engagement. You resist by refusing to react immediately, separating moral concern from public performance, limiting exposure to repetitive framing, declining to express views before understanding stabilizes, and accepting that silence is not failure. You are not obligated to hold an opinion on every issue. You are not required to signal alignment on command. Moral seriousness does not require constant declaration. In many cases, constant declaration substitutes for action and understanding. The ability to withhold judgment until clarity emerges is not cowardice. It is discipline. Narrative systems depend on speed and visibility. They weaken under patience and restraint. Once you stop feeding them reflexively, their grip loosens. Not because they disappear, but because they lose leverage over your internal state. In the next chapter, we will turn to the practical question that follows recognition: how to stop feeding manipulation altogether, not through confrontation or exposure, but through refusal, delay, and exit, quietly, deliberately, and without drama. Chapter 13. How to stop feeding manipulation. Manipulation survives on participation. This does not mean agreement. It means response. You explain yourself. You argue. You justify. You rush. You correct. Each reaction supplies energy to a system that depends on movement. The most effective defense against manipulation is not exposure. It is starvation. Starvation begins with refusal, but not dramatic refusal. Dramatic refusal invites escalation. It turns the interaction into a contest, and manipulation adapts easily to confrontation. What it struggles with is non-cooperation without explanation. The first way to stop feeding manipulation is delay. Delay breaks momentum. It dissolves urgency and restores symmetry. When you do not respond immediately, pressure loses shape. Many manipulative demands collapse when they are not acted on quickly. If something requires your immediate compliance to function, it was never stable to begin with. Delay does not require justification. Silence is often enough. The second method is non-explanation. Manipulation feeds on reasons. reasons invite debate, and debate invites pressure. The more you explain why you cannot comply, the more material you provide for persuasion. Each explanation exposes a value, fear, or priority that can be targeted. You do not owe narratives for your boundaries. Short responses protect you precisely because they offer no surface for leverage. Statements such as, "I can't do that," "That doesn't work for me," or "Not possible," feel abrupt only because manipulation has trained you to over-justify. The third method is role refusal. Many manipulative systems depend on you occupying a specific role: fixer, mediator, rescuer, buffer, responsible one. Once the role is accepted, pressure becomes automatic. You are expected to absorb friction because that is what you have always done. Role refusal does not require confrontation. It requires disengagement. You stop stepping in. You stop smoothing over. You stop compensating. Initially, this creates discomfort. Others notice the absence, and some pressure intensifies. This is the system testing whether the old pattern still holds. If you do not resume the role, the system recalibrates. The fourth method is exiting the frame. Manipulation often confines you within false choices. Do this or that. Agree or oppose. Help or harm. Exit the frame by refusing the premise. You are not obligated to choose between options designed to secure your compliance. Frame exit sounds simple and unembellished. You state that this is not how you see the situation, that you are not choosing between those options, or that the problem is not yours to solve. You are not required to resolve dilemmas that were structured to corner you. The fifth method is selective availability. Constant availability creates expectation. Expectation hardens into entitlement. Entitlement becomes pressure. By limiting availability, you reduce leverage. You become harder to corner, and requests are forced to become clearer, more deliberate, and more negotiable. Availability is power. Withholding it restores balance. Stopping manipulation does not mean becoming hostile or withdrawn. It means becoming less useful to extraction. You remain calm, civil, and present, but no longer pliable. This shift reveals important information. Some relationships improve. Some requests disappear. Some people lose interest. This is not loss. It is filtration. Manipulation requires frictionless access. When access becomes conditional, only interactions that can tolerate boundaries remain. The goal is not to eliminate manipulation from your life. That is impossible. The goal is to reduce how much of yourself it consumes without your consent. When you stop feeding manipulation, you regain time, attention, and internal quiet. These are not minor gains. They are the conditions required for judgment. In the final chapter, we will confront the hardest decision of all, knowing when the only winning move is to leave. Not every situation can be managed. Some must be exited. Understanding when to walk away and why that is power is the final step. Chapter 14. When to walk away and why it's power. Not all manipulation can be managed. Some systems are built to extract continuously. They do not respond to boundaries because boundaries threaten their function. In these environments, resistance does not lead to recalibration. It leads to escalation, punishment, or exhaustion. Knowing when to walk away is not weakness. It is strategic clarity. The first signal that exit is required is pattern persistence. If the same pressures recur despite clear boundaries, urgency returns, guilt is reapplied, roles are reimposed, then the issue is not misunderstanding. It is design. The system is structured to override your limits. Staying becomes an exercise in attrition rather than resolution. Another signal is cost asymmetry. If compliance costs you time, health, dignity, or future options, while resistance costs you only discomfort, awkwardness, or disapproval, you are being trained to sacrifice. Over time, these sacrifices accumulate. Losses that would once have been unacceptable become routine. When costs are asymmetrical and non-negotiable, exit restores balance. A third indicator is identity erosion. If maintaining a relationship, job, or role requires you to suppress judgment, lie to yourself, or repeatedly act against your values, the damage compounds. You may still function, but coherence deteriorates. Confusion increases. Resentment builds. No gain is worth sustained self-fracture. Another clear sign is inverted accountability. When you are held responsible for outcomes you do not control, while those with authority evade responsibility, the structure itself is corrupt. Effort will not fix this. Performance will not correct it. The system depends on misalignment to operate. Staying signals acceptance. Walking away is powerful because it collapses leverage. Manipulation requires access, proximity, and participation. When you leave, pressure has nowhere to land. The system must adapt without you, or redirect its force elsewhere. This is why exits are often met with shock, anger, or sudden concessions. These reactions expose how much leverage depended on your presence. Late apologies and last-minute offers are not evidence of misunderstanding. They are evidence of dependency. Exit does not need to be dramatic. It does not require moral speeches, explanations, or public exposure. Quiet departure is often the strongest move. It denies the manipulative system the performance it feeds on. You leave without becoming a story. Walking away also resets your internal standard. It reminds you that no role, relationship, or opportunity is compulsory. That choice always exists, even when it feels costly. This knowledge changes how you move through the world. You become harder to corner because you know you can leave. The mistake many people make is waiting for certainty. They wait for undeniable proof that exit is justified. They wait for the situation to become unbearable. By then, the cost of leaving is far higher than it needed to be. Strategic exit is preemptive. It is chosen while options still exist. This does not mean abandoning every difficult situation. Many pressures can be managed once recognized. But when the pattern is structural and the cost is compounding, exit preserves strength rather than depleting it. Power is not domination. Power is optionality. The ability to disengage rather than comply is one of the few forms of power that does not depend on others' cooperation. In the final coda, we will close the loop. This book is not about winning games or controlling people. It is about reclaiming authorship over your attention, time, and decisions in a world that constantly competes for them. You do not need to defeat manipulation. You need to stop belonging to it. Epilogue. You don't need to win. You need to stop losing. Most people think power is about advantage. They imagine leverage as something you accumulate in order to dominate, persuade, or outmaneuver others. This belief keeps them locked inside the very systems they are trying to escape. They remain alert, reactive, and entangled, always responding, always adjusting, always explaining, mistaking motion for agency. This book has argued for something quieter. You do not need to outplay manipulation. You need to withdraw from its mechanisms. Manipulation persists because it feeds on attention, urgency, identity, and emotion. It requires movement. It requires response. It requires you to carry pressure that was never yours to begin with. Once you stop supplying these inputs, most manipulative dynamics weaken on their own. Not immediately, but reliably. This is why clarity feels like relief. When you understand how guilt is applied, you stop rushing to resolve it. When you recognize urgency as a tactic, you slow down. When authority reveals itself as performance rather than accountability, you reclaim judgment. When identity is used as leverage, you restore boundaries. When information is framed to corner you, you step back. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the point. You stop hemorrhaging energy in small, invisible ways. You stop agreeing to things that quietly erode your position. You stop mistaking pressure for necessity. Over time, your life becomes less reactive and more deliberate, not because the world became fairer, but because you became harder to steer. This does not make you cold. It makes you contained. Contained people are not passive. They are selective. They choose where to invest effort, care, and risk. They do not confuse responsiveness with virtue. They understand that not every request deserves an answer, not every crisis deserves participation, and not every moral demand deserves compliance. This is not cynicism. It is discernment. The uncomfortable truth is that manipulation will not disappear. Institutions will continue to extract. Relationships will continue to test boundaries. Narratives will continue to demand alignment. Scarcity will continue to be used as pressure. None of this requires your permission. What does require your permission is participation. You always have fewer obligations than you think. Many of the pressures you carry persist only because you respond automatically. Once response becomes conditional, dynamics shift. Some people adjust. Some leave. Some escalate briefly and then stop. What remains is quieter, more stable, and more honest. This book does not promise safety. It promises orientation. You will still feel guilt. You will still encounter urgency. You will still feel the impulse to explain yourself. The difference is that these experiences no longer dictate your movement. They become signals rather than commands. You do not need to be fearless. You need to be slow enough to choose. In a world optimized for speed, outrage, and extraction, restraint is a form of power. Silence is a form of power. Exit is a form of power. Optionality is power. Winning is not the goal. The goal is to stop losing ground quietly, one unexamined concession at a time. When you stop feeding manipulation, you reclaim something more valuable than control over others. You reclaim control over yourself. The work is not to become untouchable, but to remain unowned. Written by Aaron Kairos. Narrated by Lyra Celine.